Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody that's joined us. We are very excited today because we have a very exciting panel of experts who between them have approximately 50 years of working on issues that are related to the strategic approach to international chemicals management and also sound management of chemicals and waste. This webinar is particularly relevant to you because we are at a unique moment in time where what we agree during this intersessional process will define what our agreement on chemicals and waste looks like into the future. So for those of you that are preparing for your regional meetings or preparing for IP4, what you hear now and what you act on is what will shape the future agreement on SAICM. We will have experts from health and environmental justice. We will have Alex Katrobo and Dr. Olga Speranskaya, and they will present on the virtual working group outcomes during the intersessional process. And we'll also hear from experts at the Centre for International Environmental Law. And as I said, we are very excited to share the space with you, and we are looking forward to having an ongoing discussion in the intersessional process as we begin to shape our global treaty on chemicals and waste. Okay.
Thank you, Rico, and thank you, everyone. Welcome to our webinar also from my side. I want to give you a short overview about SAICM. So next slide. No, it's not working. The strategic approach to international chemicals management was signed in 2006 at the first session of the International Conference on Chemicals Management. The conference adopted the Dubai Declaration on International Chemicals Management and the overarching policy strategy. The conference also recommended the use and further development of the Global Plan of Action as a working tool and guidance document. Together, these three documents constitute SAICM. By signing SAICM, more than 100 governments took a global commitment to minimize harms to human health and the environment from manufacturing and using chemicals by 2020. SAICM is a unique global strategy focused on creating a world in which chemicals are no longer produced or used in ways that harm human health and the environment. Nevertheless, the SAICM mandate expired in 2020. But what is next? Already back in 2013, 7 years prior to the SAICM expiry date, the African region noted that, I quote, "The challenges of sound chemicals management will continue beyond 2020 as new chemicals are added to the market and as new emerging policy issues are identified," end quote. That was confirmed in the second edition of the Global Chemical Outlook, which states that SAICM 2020 goal has not been achieved. Pollution increases and adversely affects both human and non-human life. It is obvious that SAICM has not achieved its goal and more work has to be done beyond 2020. What should the new instrument, a new framework, include? Some ideas were supposed to be addressed during the intersessional process. This process was intended to develop recommendations regarding the strategic approach and the sound management of chemicals and waste beyond 2020. 3 meetings of the intersessional process were successfully conducted. However, the COVID-19 pandemic slowed the process substantially by putting the 4th meeting and the 5th session of ICCM on hold. However, a decision was made to continue working virtually, and 4 virtual working groups were set up to discuss the most important parts of the future instruments. The work of the groups was linked to the compilation of recommendations document prepared for IP4. The work of the virtual working groups was not intended to substitute face-to-face negotiations at IP4 or ICCM 5, but rather was intended to brainstorm on the key technical issues and prepare delegates for these important negotiations. Now I would like to give the floor to Olga, who will share with you the key outcomes of the work conducted by the virtual working groups.
I'd like to briefly tell you about some key outcomes of the work of the virtual working groups, starting with the virtual working group 1 that was focused on targets, indicators, and milestones. And here on this slide, you see key highlights included into the outcome report prepared by the co-facilitators of this virtual working group. The group developed recommendations for a process to establish indicators and milestones for finalized targets, and identified potential institutions responsible for data collection, and also suggested options for a process to further develop targets. In addition, it developed a set of targets based on the convergence of views among stakeholders and a set of new targets that the stakeholders agreed to continue the discussion on. And also a list containing new targets which were discussed in the virtual working group 1, but for which there was no general agreement to move the discussion forward, was also prepared and included as annex to the co-facilitators report. And next slide, please. So regarding the recommendations on indicators, the virtual working group 1 agreed that indicators should be measurable and meaningful so that they help providing a clear picture of the effectiveness of achievements of the strategic objectives and targets. Also, indicators should be limited in number to better manage the review and better communicate reporting outcomes. And the monitoring effort should be as simple and affordable as possible and include relevant indicators that are already monitored. And during the discussion in this virtual working group, the Intergovernmental Organization of Chemicals Management and UN Economic Commission for Europe have expressed their willingness to support the development of an inventory of currently available indicators. And next slide, please. Regarding the work on targets, the discussed targets are linked to strategic objective A, B, C, D, and E, and reflect the views among stakeholders. Many targets are process-based and not impact-based. Here in these slides, we give the examples of some targets that are included in Parts I of the co-facilitators report. And targets in these parts include those with finalized text, which was agreed by the virtual working group stakeholders, or there are targets for which the virtual working group stakeholders agreed to continue the discussion. In the co-facilitators report, you will find the text of such targets and the rationale for inclusion. Please note that even if the text of a target was agreed by the virtual working group stakeholders, it is still in brackets or in track changes, waiting for the discussion at IP4 because the virtual working groups are not intended to substitute the discussion at IP4 and SAICM 5. So on this slide, we gave an example of a finalized targets so that you can see how such targets are presented in the report. And 2 examples of new targets discussed by the virtual working group 1. For example, the importance of addressing the illegal international trade was not part of any other targets. Thus, it was decided to draft a separate target on this issue. Another example is the target focusing on the impact of pollution on ecosystem services and biodiversity. And the reason for this new target is that other targets were not adequately integrating issues on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So, however, there were also new targets that were not included in Parts I of the co-facilitator report because there was no agreement to move the discussion forward. And these targets are in the annex to the report, but not in Parts I. But many of these new targets are suggested by non-governmental organizations and are very important because they contain concrete risk reduction activities that will help minimize exposure to toxic chemicals and waste. And next slide, please. Slide 9, yes. So here on this slide, you see examples of targets suggested by NGOs for the strategic objective A on measures to minimize harm from toxic chemicals. And a full list of targets suggested by NGOs is available in our report. But examples here include new target A5 that states that by 2030, all countries have prohibited the export of substances that they have prohibited nationally. And this is an important target in line with the recently approved the European Union Chemical Strategy for Sustainability. And the strategy highlights the importance of phasing out export of hazardous chemicals banned in the EU. But nevertheless, this target has not been included in Part I of the co-facilitators report, and as there was no mutual support among the stakeholders of this virtual working group. And next slide, please. Slide 10. Yes. So a few more examples of NGO-driven targets are listed on this slide, and these targets are linked to strategic objective B on data generation and availability. And they are focused on the development of a global minimum cross-sectoral transparency standard for chemicals of global concern in products to support the work on chemicals and products internationally and in national implementation plans, and to achieve a non-toxic circular economy. And you may wish to learn more about these targets and the overall concept of a global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products on our new website listed on this slide. It's globalchemicaltransparency.org. And now I would like to give the floor to Alex to present the work of the virtual working group 2.
Yes, thank you, Olga. Sorry for being too fast. So next slides, please. Next slide, please. Virtual working group 2 was about governance and mechanisms to support implementations. The working group was supposed to give recommendations on section B on national implementation, section C on regional and sectoral cooperation and coordination, section D on enhanced sectoral and stakeholder engagement, section E on subsidiary and ad hoc expert bodies, section G on taking stock of progress. Next slide, please. Yes, on section B, national implementation, there were a few points that have been raised and that are also reflected in the outcome report, which is that each government should develop national plans of action for implementation on an interministerial or interinstitutional basis. And it's also being said that this should be done in consultation with stakeholders. Another point was that different stakeholders should engage, and also sectors, to address also national priorities in these plans. The plan should be used for reporting on the progress of the future SAICM framework, and a national focal point should be established to facilitate communication and coordination. Next slide, please. I will not give you details about all sections, but you can read more about that in our report. I would like to highlight something on section G, which is taking stock of progress. And that is that the virtual working group thought that all stakeholders should contribute to the assessment of the progress, and they should also provide information on their implementation efforts. The information that is provided should be transparent and publicly available. And the reporting process should occur regularly and provide sufficient information to assess progress of the new instrument. Our demand as NGOs is that institutional arrangements for stock taking of the progress should also include a multi-stakeholder periodic review process, which is facilitated by the Secretariat. And this has also been taken up in the outcome report. Next slide, please. The working group was also tasked with the development of recommendations for a science policy interface. But as you all know, UNEA 5 had a resolution which was adopted about the science policy interface. So some of these recommendations are already like done during the or in the resolution, but nevertheless, it's interesting to look at the recommendations because they are important for the process to set up and develop such a scientific policy interface. So of course, it should be inclusive and all relevant stakeholders and sectors should be there. It should be mindful of the need to ensure expertise from developing countries and indigenous communities. It should not be policy prescriptive, but of course should give, from our perspective, policy recommendations. And it should provide clarity that the work of any SPI would not be a duplication of existing efforts. So next slide, please. Here we have listed some of the NGO thoughts on this SPI. I will not read it out like all the points, but what is very important for us is that the scientists on such a panel should have no political, commercial, or economic interest. There should be no conflict of interest, and this should be clearly stated in the TORs. There should be a mechanism that can reject scientists if it is if it's clear that there are potential conflicts of interests or if they are detected. And ideally, we think there should be an advisory group that is independent from governments. So the rest on this long, crowdy slide, you can read yourself later. And with this, I hand over to Olga.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So a few words about the key outcomes of the virtual working group 3. So slide 16, please. So this virtual working group was focused on issues of concern. And it was aimed at developing proposals for draft procedures for the identification, nomination, selection, review, and prioritization of the issues of concern. It was also aimed to determine the need for further work of an issue of concern and develop proposals on how to deal with existing issues of concern. And next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So regarding the new issues of concern, it was agreed that any stakeholder can nominate an issue of concern. So all nominations must be submitted no later than 6 months before the meeting of the International Conference on Chemicals Management. And the nominations will have a possibility to revise the nomination, and all selected issues of concern will be adopted by a resolution of ICCM. So monitoring and reporting back from stakeholders regarding the implementation of the work plan of an issue of concern will be conducted by the ad hoc multi-stakeholder committee with the Secretariat's support. And after evaluating the implementation of the plan of action, ICCL will determine the need for further work on a given issue. And next slide, please. So slide 18, yes. Here on this slide, you see a list of information that could be provided to nominate an issue of concern. For example, it should be explained why the Beyond 2020 instrument is the one that should advance the issue. Or, for example, how addressing the issue can assist countries in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Or what knowledge and gaps exist in understanding about the issue. A list of priority actions and related timelines should also be presented to guide the implementation. And next slide, please. Slide 19, yes. So, but how about existing issues of concern? As we all know, there are 8 of them, and they are listed on these slides. We all know them very well. And next slide, please. Slide 20. So there are numerous scientific evidence showing that these issues are not less important than persistent organic pollutants or mercury, for example. Some chemicals considered under existing SAICM issues of concern, like, for example, EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals, specifically target women's health and thus negatively affect the health of the future generations. Next slide, please. So, however, despite the importance of the existing issues of concern, they are still not high on political agenda. And advances are mainly limited to the information collection, and not many risk reduction activities have been implemented so far. And we know that exposure to chemicals of high concern continues through products, including plastic, and only about 10% of highly hazardous pesticides, HHPs, are covered by existing conventions. And we can, of course, continue this very sad evidences. Next slide, please. So the Virtual Working Group 3 developed a vision of the omnibus resolution on existing emerging policy issues and other issues of concern. And the resolution should recognize the progress on issues of concern under SAICM and reference the assessment of the SAICM issues of concern in the independent evaluation of 2006 till 2015, and also note the assessment report on issues of concern made by UNEP recently. And in addition, note that any of the current existing issues of concern that are taken forward should continue under the new instruments. Next slide, please. So what is the NGO vision on existing issues of concern? So we believe that all issues of concern, all existing issues of concern, should be moved under the new instrument on sound chemicals and waste management beyond 2020. And stakeholders' responsibility should be significantly elevated to achieve effective risk reduction for each and every issue of concern. And the modalities for reviewing issues of concern and how the ICCM should respond to reviews must be established. And we suggested criteria or triggers that can be used to evaluate progress on issues of concern implementation and decide whether the obligations of stakeholders to address these issues should be moved to a higher level. So these criteria are listed and described in the paper referenced on this slide, and the document is available on SAICM IP4 website as an information document. Next slide, please. So we briefly listed the criteria on this slide, and we believe that meeting even one criterion is sufficient for increasing the obligations on stakeholders concerning implementing activities related to a particular issue of concern. Next slide, please. So we definitely recommend that the suggested criteria are included in the new Beyond 2020 instrument as the basis for determining whether an issue of concern should be elevated to an increased level of obligation. And we also think that a multi-stakeholder working group should be established to review information and factors contributed to limited success in implementation in addressing issues of concern. And we recommend to develop a mechanism of action under the new Beyond 2020 instrument for elevating an issue of concern that has not progressed sufficiently to an increased level of obligation, and based on the assessment using these criteria. And next slide, please. So as I already mentioned, the paper presenting triggers or criteria and the background information is available on IP4 websites. along with 3 case studies on chemicals and products, highly hazardous pesticides, and PFAS chemicals. And these papers describe the use of criteria in assessing the level of addressing these issues of concern, as well as suggest ways forward. For chemicals and products, a way forward is the development of a global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals and products that will help establish equal level of safety for everyone, everywhere. And with this, thank you very much. And Rico, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga. And thank you very much to all of the participants that are dropping their questions in the chat and also dropping their contact details in the chat because they want more information on the specific topic and they want more information about this presentation and also about the issues that we've been discussing. So our final presentation now, before we open it up to the floor and open up in a plenary discussion to take some of the questions, is from our colleague David Azule. And many of you will know David. He is now the managing attorney at CIEL's Geneva office. And he's also a director of CIEL's environmental health program. David has been working as an attorney in international law in France and in Spain, and he now specializes in environmental law. Before he joined CIEL, he was a lawyer at a law firm, and he was also a program coordinator with Friends of the Earth Europe. So also a lot of experience in understanding networks and NGOs, and also working closely with governments. Now, David's work now at CIEL is very important because it is at the confluence of science and policy. And for those of you that know David, most recently his work involves working on the Plastics Treaty and bringing a wealth of expertise into that arena. He's been working in the EU space, in the global space, for almost 13 years now. So thank you very much, David. And David will share perspectives on Working Group 4. Thank you, David. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rico, for that very extensive presentation. I feel a little humbled. And thank you very much to HEJSupport and groundwork for organizing this very timely workshop. So I attended and participated in the coordination of NGO input into the virtual working group number 4 that was focused on finance and financial discussion. So first of all, to give a little context about finance discussion, those of you who have been involved in any sorts of international negotiations around chemicals will remember that this is always one of the trickiest conversation. This is always one of the conversations that drags until the very end of the negotiations themselves, and one on which there are some very strong and polarized views, and one on which it is quite difficult to make a lot of progress. In the context of SAICM, when SAICM was first adopted, it included a financing mechanism, an own financing mechanism that was built into the strategic approach called the Quick Start Program, which was relatively easily accessible for both countries and stakeholders, and which was recognized as the major success of SAICM that really helped put SAICM both on the map and put SAICM's successes also on the map of chemical management. The Quick Start program was designed as a time-limited funding mechanism, and so it was ended after a few years and was later replaced by, or sort of replaced by, a mechanism called the Special Program, which is now only accessible to government, which conditions for access a little more restrictive and complex for governments, and the scope of which is a little more narrow as it focuses mainly on government capacity building and management capacity building. The midterm evaluation of SAICM was mentioned a couple of times in previous presentation, and it is important to note that the question of finance in SAICM was identified as one of the key elements for the future success of SAICM. The QSP was identified as one of the major drivers for the successes, which all really reinforced the dynamic of wanting to develop adequate financing mechanism for the implementation of SAICM, for the implementation of the sound management of chemicals throughout the life cycle. A final element of context that I would want to add is that currently the chemical and waste cluster, which usually comprises or is considered to comprise the Convention of Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, Minamata, and SAICM, is severely, and I can't stress that enough, severely underfunded. The main financing mechanism comes through the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. It's a fund, and it is replenished, or it is bonded to by governments on a 4 or 5 year cycle basis. We have just finalized the 8th replenishment of the GEF, which showed a significant increase of funding overall for environmental issues, but in particular for waste and chemical cluster. But even with that quite substantive replenishment, the estimated gaps for implementing only certain aspects of the Stockholm Convention, the banning of PCB, which is really a very, very small sliver of what of the overall needs for chemical management. So the gap is has been assessed at over $4 billion. And that is just to eliminate one set of very dirty chemicals regulated under Stockholm, when we know that SAICM is actually much, much broader than this. And so all of this to give you the context, to give you the reason why this question around finance is key for the futures, for the success of the future instrument that will follow up SAICM, and also why this is one that is relatively difficult and on which progress has been, I would say, rather slower than in other virtual working group. It is due both to the nature of the discussion itself and to the fact that, as usual, the finance discussions are held until the very end of the negotiations. Having said that, because it was a major issue and was identified as a major issue by the vast majority of participating countries and organizations in SAICM, it was the object of Virtual Working Group 4. And the mandate that was given to the Virtual Working Group number 4 was to work on the financing of the chemical and waste cluster in itself, but also secretariat financing, which is a different issue. The first one is financing of the measures, the implementation of the measures in SAICM. The secretariat is really about how do you provide adequate funding for the secretariat to be able to function. It also looked into partnerships, capacity building, cost recovery mechanism, and all of those issues that really relate to providing adequate resources for the implementation of SAICM. Before the working group took place, before the virtual working group took place, there was an open-ended working group of SAICM that was organized in Montevideo a few months before COVID hit. And at this meeting and the previous one, the IP3 meeting that took place in Bangkok, a number of regions had made quite specific and strong proposal to address the funding shortage in SAICM. The first proposal came from the GRULAC and African region. It was calling for a dedicated fund to be created and established to support SAICM implementation, with some measures relating to how this fund would be bonded to. In preparation of the virtual working group, all participants were invited to put forward proposals and suggestions of how that could work. Of note, I think, worth noting, was a proposal by the entire African region to establish a global mechanism for levy, or global tax or levy, on a very small number of what we call basic chemicals. So it's about 30 chemicals that form the basis of all the industrial chemistry that we know of. And the idea was that by implementing a very, very small levy on only those 30 chemicals, a levy of about 0.5% on those specific chemicals, that would allow the collection of over 10 billion a year, over $10 billion a year, without creating an impact that would be too strong or too bad on an industry that is flourishing around the world. And so those are, and NGOs on their hand, CIEL and IPEN, had prepared quite an extensive report in advance of those virtual groups to support or inspire various proposals. And this is in this report that we came up with this proposal for a global levy. The CIEL and IPEN document talks about a 0.1% tax. It was adapted by the African region to go a little beyond that, but really the core of the proposals are the same. And so these are some of the most noteworthy proposals that came to the virtual working group. Now, I must say that the participation in the virtual working group and the carrying out of the virtual working group was mirrored with quite a number of difficulties. Participation was relatively low. I think on average, even though there were over 160 participants registered, I think on average during the meeting, we had between 20 and 35 participants, which is an extremely low number to discuss such an important issue. And even then, only a small subset of those participants actually actively participated, took the floor. The virtual working group was also mirrored with technical challenges. A number of delegates from the developing countries had a lot of trouble to join or to juggle between the various obligations, because this came at the time that was really full of webinar and the world was just coming to term with finding ways to adjust to the new COVID situation. There was also some confusion in the process, whether we were actually negotiating, even though the Secretariat had been very clear that this would not be a negotiating space. There was push by a number of participants to start actually negotiating text and trying to clean text from previous document that was refused, but that created also some delay in how the virtual working group worked. And the final thing that can be said in general around this was that the outcome was relatively limited. We did go through the text. There were quite a lot of proposals that were made around this, but and a lot of the proposals that were made are now compiled in the outcome document from the virtual working group. So this is something that you can consult. But you'll see that we're mostly talking about cosmetic changes to the existing financing mechanism or provisions in SAICM, rather than something really revolutionary or something that could have a chance to really make a difference in that respect. The conversation was structured largely around the integrated approach to chemical and waste, to the integrated approach to the financing of the chemical and waste cluster, which was a framework that was adopted by UNEA that identified three main pillars for the financial mechanism. It's mainstreaming, country participation, external funding, and industry participation. A lot of the challenges focused around the industry participation. And in that respect, what I can at least mention now, because I see that I'm running out of time, the industry proposed a capacity building clearinghouse, which would be a sort of mechanism where information about existing funding mechanism, in part for capacity building, would be made available to all countries to identify potential sources of funding. It was deemed very insufficient by a large number participants, and clearly by the NGOs and trade unions participating in this work. And so in conclusion, what can be said is that there's still a lot of work to be done to ensure that the future SAICM instrument will be adequately funded, and we should be ready for very difficult conversation in that respect, even though there are some quite innovative ideas that are being put forward. Currently, most of the donor countries and industry are very reluctant to explore these innovative ways of funding. And so there is a threat overhanging over the whole process, that this process, however, whatever provisions we can negotiate, might be underfunded, and that might create a real challenge for implementation. Thank you very much, and sorry for having been a little long.
Thank you very much, David. I think those are very, very useful thoughts, and that closing remark is something that we should all have in our minds as we get closer to the intersessional process meeting in Bucharest, because it will dominate a lot of the discussion. The intention now, everybody, is that we open it up as a plenary to questions. If you have a pressing question now, if you would raise your hand and we can acknowledge you and you can ask your question. Otherwise, as we wait for people to raise their hands, maybe Alex or Olga, if you could perhaps respond to the question that was posted in the chat that you have already responded to.
Thank you, Rika. I just, first of all, I responded to one of the questions. Yes, we definitely can do this, but I would like to, could you please upload slides, the last slide, not the very last, but the slide before the last slides. While people are thinking about the questions or comments, yes, thank you very much. So we would like to briefly outline our vision of the potential outcomes of the intersessional process. We believe that it is important to develop measurable targets, indicators, and milestones for actions that minimize and eliminate actual sources of toxic chemical exposure throughout the entire life cycle. So these targets should be really meaningful and not like process-based. So we also believe that it is important to develop a mechanism of action to progress issues of concern to the level with increased obligations on stakeholders. And we will be very happy if you're interested in this process, and would love to have like an online discussion specifically focusing on this mechanism of action. And also, we think that it is important to make a concrete plan for sustainable financing. What David just presented, it's so very much important to have like new financing, confirmed financing, enough financing to actually implement the activities that will be listed in the Beyond 2020 strategy. So having like a capacity building mechanism, a clearinghouse, it's probably important, but definitely way not enough to get rid of for toxic exposure throughout the whole life cycle. So we also think that the new mechanism and the intersessional process should highlight gender and chemical safety. And so we had several webinars and many organizations like set up several discussions on highlighting the importance of addressing the issue of women and chemicals, toxic exposure of women at workplaces, at home, different sources of exposure. So this is a burning issue that definitely has to be addressed in the new instrument. And also this new instrument should incorporate the human rights dimension of chemical safety. So being free from toxic chemical exposure is the right, is the human right of each and every person in the world, no matter where this person lives. So this definitely has to be highlighted in the new instrument. And also it is important to develop a plan for effectiveness evaluation and strengthen SAICM institutional arrangements, because many countries still lack these institutional arrangements, which do not allow them to effectively implement a chemical safety policy and effectively participate in the discussions, both nationally, regionally, and internationally. So these are like a very brief list of the outcomes that we are definitely expecting from the intersessional process. And there may be many more other points. Yeah, so thank you very much, Rico, for having this. And yes, these are our contacts, and we will be happy again to accommodate your requests or answer questions or send you the links to our reports.
Okay.
So
thank you very much, Olga. I'll leave the last slide up so that people can see the contact details. In the meantime, I acknowledge Wand Wasson's question.
Yes, thank you.
Wand Wasson, you can unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
I have unmuted. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. This is very informative workshop, and it is very timely because we are having regional meetings. For instance, there is an upcoming meeting in Accra, basically discussing about most of these issues. My concern or question is about the science policy platform, and you have mentioned that this has been discussed within the virtual meetings that was carried out. The open-ended working group will begin its work maybe in October or November this year, and one of the issues that will be discussed is about structure, inclusivity, that like you have mentioned. How much of inclusivity are we anticipating as NGO circle? Because there is a tendency, which I evidenced, to model the upcoming SPI as according to IPCC BUS, where governments dominate, the structure, and the final decision making would be done by governments. Even the discussions. In the discussions that I hear, there is some kind of reservation about to include NGO voices or industry, industry voices, etc. But the chemicals we are discussing about, they need more information to be out and more involvement in decision making. So maybe there needs to be some position around positioning heavily the involvement of NGOs, so that it will be really meaningful in action. My question, another question, is about the virtual meetings. They will not replace IP4, but what will be the status of it? Just your view on that. Another issue about issues of concern. You said enhanced level of obligation. Can you clarify on that? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Wand Wasson. Our panelists, let's start with David and then go to others. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'll respond to at least one of the questions for you, which is a very good question. What will be the status of the outcome document from the virtual working? So please make sure, everyone, please make sure you're muted. Thanks. And so what will be the status of these documents? So it was made clear that they were not negotiated text, and so they would not be accepted to serve as the basis for future negotiation at IP4, and they will therefore be annexed to the document, information document moved on to IP4. However, it is very clear that for those countries who have been trying to use the virtual working group and to push forward their use, they will be bring back into the negotiations the content of the virtual working group, arguing for sure that we're limited in time for what we now have to negotiate. And so it would be a little ridiculous to duplicate and to redo the work or to ignore the work, the very productive discussion that have been done. And so while they have no official status, it is my own personal expectation that these virtual working group outcome document will indeed and effectively be used in the context of the future negotiation and will likely play quite an important role in shaping the future of the agreement. Even though they're not supposed to do that officially, this is something that could be largely expected. And I'll let Olga and Alex respond to your other questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for these important questions. I love the way you highlighted the importance of NGO participation in the science policy interface. This is what we have been advocating for, like from the very beginning, because we strongly believe that so-called citizen science should be seriously considered by the science policy interface or the science policy platform, whatever it is. So citizen science, knowledge from indigenous peoples are key to ensure that no one is behind, nothing is forgotten, because NGOs can generate data and information that academic science may miss, and or may not even know that this information exists. So the participation of NGOs in the negotiations on a science policy interface and science policy platform is very important to ensure that our concerns are well incorporated into this. Regarding your second question about the higher level of obligations on stakeholders on the implementation of issues of concern, as I said, so there are 3 papers that are available on IP4 website platform that describe in details how to what these actions might be. Right, and our idea of the global minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products is one of such approaches for chemicals in products as an issue of concern. And we don't have time to go into details into this, but we hope that this standard will be considered, and probably even the plastic treaty that will be negotiated like shortly. The negotiations will start shortly. It will also consider like including the idea of a minimum transparency standard for hazardous chemicals in products as a tool for ensuring that there is a transparency of information on toxic plastic additives in plastic products. And that, if it happens, that will be a tremendous breakthrough in terms of public right to know, transparency of information, and it will go then beyond the plastic treaty to other treaties, both existing and newly negotiated.
Thank you,
Yes.
Olga, and thank you, David. Dennis, I see your hand, and I encourage you to ask your question. In the meantime, David and Alex, if you could maybe reflect on the questions in the chat and just provide some perspectives following Dennis's question. Thank you, Dennis.
Yes, hello everyone. Are you hearing me?
We hear you fine, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Dear colleagues, I would like, one moment, yeah. Dear colleagues, I would like to add to the Olga Spiranskaya speech about scientific evidence, because when we talk about scientific evidence and mechanisms to implementation, to support implementation, I would like to say that civil society and NGO sector in this process very important on the national level, because when we talk about legally binding documents, and implementation all of these documents, sometimes for our government need scientific evidence to continue work and to explain as a central authority how these instruments can be work and why these instruments can be work. And sometimes from the central authority, from the government, we have a lot of issues, a lot of questions and requests to explain how it have to be work, and how sometimes how this is barriers can be better for Ukraine and have negative effect on the cooperation between other countries in the framework of different agreements and different documents and associations. Sometimes Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian institutions haven't information about situation, about this issues of concern on the national level, and they ask about providing these materials and scientific evidences. And NGO who is a members of white chemicals networks have all of this information, and together with scientific institutions can make scientific evidences which can be based for the continue of this work. And for example, it's scientific evidence about limit of lead in paint for Ukrainian market, for Ukraine. Thus, when we together with government, together with scientific institutions and NGO organize this is cooperation and prepare it, this is scientific evidence, it's help us to solve the problem with submission of the technical regulation. Thus, I would like to focus and pay attention that about the mechanisms to support legally binding documents which are based on the scientific evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah. Alex, would you like to respond to some of the?
Yes, so I also had, so I put some answers in the chat, and there was also some direct messages. So one was about GHS. GHS is coming up again and again in all these discussions, and we see a tendency of governments that they say, okay, GHS first, and then maybe we talk about the rest one time. So this is, yes, we agree that GHS is important, of course, but it cannot be limited to GHS implementation. SAICM has to be more than that, and has to be more ambitious than all the legally binding agreements, because it's not legally binding. And we cannot just go for the super low-hanging fruits. We need to be, as I said, much more ambitious. And so here I see, especially when you had a look at the already ongoing regional meetings, there is a tendency from some countries to simplify things, to lower the ambitions, to say, let's just do what we really can achieve. But we should do both. We should include things that we really can achieve, and we should include things that we can achieve maybe in some years. And it's, as we also heard from Dennis, it's SAICM is supposed to be a forum to talk about everything that has no other forum that covers these topics. And this is what we need, because many countries have no other entry point than SAICM to raise topics in their, or NGOs to raise topics in their countries by saying, look, EDCs are an emerging issue in SAICM. We have to talk about this in our country. Look, nanomaterials are an issue, and we have to talk about this in our country. So it's also, it should help NGOs and other actors to raise issues and topics, share, as Dennis said, share scientific or other materials. So yeah, we shouldn't just go for for a limited, like tiny amount of targets that are super easy. I mean, it should be more than that from my perspective. So that I think was almost already a closing statement from my side.
Thank you, Alex. I will accept that as some closing remarks. David, do you want to make any closing remarks considering what you've seen in the text and what you've heard?
Well, maybe not just a direct remark on the text itself, because I think I've wrapped my closing remark about the finance and the text. Maybe a general comment around SAICM. SAICM has been an incredibly useful tool for countries and for NGOs to also raise the level of understanding and awareness about the challenges about chemicals all around the world and in countries. And if the output or outcome cannot all or easily be traced back to SAICM, I think it is very heartwarming to see some of the progress that has been made in a lot of countries in the matter of waste and chemical management. And this kind of progress can be seen. SAICM discussions are difficult, but we can see the kinds of progress, we can witness this level of progress by looking at the discussion that are happening in the BRS space, in the plastic space. You can tell that the level of understanding and awareness around chemical issues is much bigger than it was 10 years ago. And that is in great part thanks to SAICM. So now there is the risk that SAICM becomes obsolete. We know that policymakers have a tendency to like new shiny stuff and get less interested about instruments that have existed for some time. They want new things. They're a bit like kids and their toys in that matter. And I think it is important to ensure that we keep on using SAICM and leverage SAICM both to reduce the risk on the ground and raise awareness about the challenges and risks of chemical mismanagement. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, David. And Olga, the last word is yours before we close. And to see that we still have 63 people on this webinar is testament about how relevant and how topical this issue is. And just before Olga goes, I'd just like to say we are open to having bilateral or smaller group discussions with anybody, whether you are from a government or from an NGO, whether you want to speak to our finance experts or to speak to issues of concern. We are happy to facilitate a smaller discussion, a focused discussion, so that we have a good and robust participation at the intersessional process. Olga?
Yes, thank you, Rika. I would like to use this opportunity, first of all, briefly return back to the GHS discussion. And GHS is really unique. It started like voluntary instruments, a capacity building tool. And now some countries really implement it into their national legislations. So this is how it worked for the GHS. And on July the 6th, there will be a community of practice holding a discussion on capacity building tools with a focus on GHS. And I should say that Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia is among like few countries that really incorporate the GHS requirements into their national legislation. So it is moving, right? But overall, I would like to say that I would really love to see the new instrument to be ambitious, to be really like focusing on reducing risk. And unfortunately, I'm very much concerned about financing. If you remember, the Quick Start program that was specifically established to fund SAICM was quite successful, with many projects supported, and countries and stakeholders were equally supported, sort of. Like NGOs could have like applied by themselves to this Quick Start program and receive funding. That was really a very progressive vision that totally reflects the vision of the whole SAICM, that everyone is equal in the negotiations, in the discussions, and in the implementation of SAICM. But the Quick Start program came to the end, and it was substituted by a special program with a completely different approach. that prioritizes, not only prioritizes, actually governments are the only eligible entity to apply for funding. And it is up to the governments whether to involve NGOs into their applications or not. That deprives NGO groups, civil society groups from any funding to tackle SAICM issues, existing issues of concern at the moment. So we hope that will be changed, and that the approach of the special program should be very seriously reconsidered so that NGOs become eligible to apply by themselves for the projects they need and for the projects they prioritize in the frame of a SAICM implementation. So having said that, I would like to echo Rico and others, and we would very much love to have bilateral discussions with you, like international discussions with you on the future of SAICM, on the future instrument of Beyond 2020. And definitely, I totally agree with David, and I hope that the outcomes of the virtual working groups will be seriously considered at the IP4 negotiations in Romania in August, and will not become like an information document that you can consult but do not need to pay much attention to. A lot of energy and efforts were put into the discussions within the virtual working groups. The outcomes reports are very comprehensive and complete, and all information is bracketed. As I said at the beginning, it's not a substitution to the negotiations, but definitely needs to be considered seriously. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining our webinar today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and the final act in all of this for me is to thank everybody who participated and for your interest. I see some of you have joined a little bit late. Perhaps there was a bit of confusion around the time, but I see we have recorded your name and your email address in the chat. And to all of those who have dropped their names and their email addresses in the chat, we will share with you the presentation and also the recording. So you don't have to worry too much about that. So thank you very much, everybody. And I wish you a very good weekend. And for those of you that are coming to Romania, to Bucharest, we look forward to seeing you there and coordinating more with you once we are in Bucharest. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Rico, everybody.
Yeah, and thanks to the speakers. Yeah, thank you very much, the speakers. Yeah.
Thank you, Rico. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.